Good morning and welcome everybody to the October webinar. This is the second in our new series, and I think I'm muted now. This is the second in our series, and I'd like once again to thank you for joining us this morning, especially as for some of you, this will be the second day this week that you've been pulled away from your desks. However, it was great catching up with you in person. This time with a number of you who attended the Seriti conference on Tuesday morning. Just for interest's sake, and before we get started, a few news articles grabbed my attention earlier this morning, a few of which I'll mention just in case you've not yet had an opportunity to go through your own news feed. The first being that South Africa is unlikely to avoid being grey-listed due to flaws in the financial security system, and experts believe that we won't have these in place before the February FATF plenary. Something that shouldn't surprise you is that PRASA has achieved only 19% of its KPI targets, and that the new trend in hijacking is now at fast food outlets. So, Johan, if you can be careful out there, that would be great. I'd like to point out that, again, although these webinars are aimed primarily at the key individuals of dealerships, there should be no reason why your F&Is or business managers could not benefit from these sessions. And again, for this purpose, the content of these webinars will be converted into CPD sessions and loaded onto our web platform. So if you feel that any of these sessions will be of value, please let your F&Is complete them. This particular webinar has been accredited with 2 hours of notional CPD through the IISA. So if you can ensure that you've enrolled correctly with your names, email addresses, and ID number. And this time I'm more than positive that the setup of the registration was done correctly. And you should have received your CPD certificates from last month by now. If you've not, please can you drop Johan, who has joined this particular webinar, an email, and he will get them out to you later on today. There has been a slight tweak to our schedule. Some of you may recall that we were going to touch on legislation on the horizon and a bit on the FIC. However, with the new captive arrangements being set out by the regulator, we deemed that this would be far more important and urgent. So the session 1 will cover the updates to the cell captive arrangements, of which there will be a Q&A session afterwards. And this will then be followed by a quick chat on the service level agreements that should be in place with their important changes. Again, the Q&A sessions will be open for around about 10 minutes. So if your questions couldn't be attended to or questions come to mind in the second or first presentation, if you could drop an email to info@acmotor.co.za or to Peter, who is our panelist. And this information will be broadcast at the end of the webinar.
Thank you. A draft conduct standard was published in 2020, which upset, I think, every cell captive owner that we work with. As a draft, it was open for comments, and those comments and objections lodged by interested parties could be counted in their dozens, which was actually not at all surprising. I mean, we ourselves put many objections forward explaining why we believe that what they proposed was not in the interest of the very policyholders that they wish to protect. Now, I was silent for 2 years, and then out of the blue, we learned from Weber Wentzel that the conduct standard had been tabled in the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces. What was particularly concerning was that despite the numerous comments and objections, we were informed that it was tabled virtually unchanged from that original draft. When we finally managed to get a copy, we saw that the only changes were a few additions to the definitions and words, making little, if any, difference to the actual legislation that they wanted to introduce. On the 3rd of October, we received the actual conduct standard stating that it had been triggered on the 1st of October. My presentation today intends to outline how this will affect cell owners in the motor sector, and I'll conclude with some of the ideas that are circulating in the industry to counter what these are now being called unfavorable regulations. This is the agenda that I've got in mind for today, and I'll start with some background and highlight the reasons why the regulator believes it's necessary to implement this conduct standard. Then I'll go through the actual requirements, but I'm going to concentrate on the impact it's going to have on motor dealerships rather than the insurers, although their responsibilities in terms of this legislation are quite onerous. And finally, as I said earlier, I'll chat about some of the ideas that are circulating around the market. Whether these ideas will be workable, we really don't know at this stage. Cell captive ownership and its regulation has been on the regulator's agenda for, as far as we know, the last 15 years. During those years, a number of proposals were put forward by FSCA's predecessor, the FSB, but always they were satisfactorily argued by the market, so no action has ever been taken. In 2009, the FSB requested all insurers that offered some form of cell captive arrangement to provide full details as to what each cell consisted of and how that insurer itself supervised the cell captive handling and its management. It took the FSB another 4 years, and there was a whole stack of market consultation. And after that, they came up with what they thought was the way to deal with cell captives. Their idea at the time was to demand greater oversight by the captive carrier and then limit cell ownership to certain types of persons. Now, this was the first time that the concept of affinity was included, which they defined as insurance business which is ancillary to the primary business activity of the cell owner, and where the insurance risk is directly connected to the primary product provider by the cell owner. Now, that of course suited the motor industry. Sadly, other practitioners in the market objected. So that proposal was withdrawn, and it was back to the drawing board. In 2016, more information was requested from all insurers that handled some form of cell captive insurance. At that stage, not every cell was formalized, and different insurers had kind of different views on how cell captives could be established and administered. The questionnaire that insurers had to complete was in 3 parts and supplied the regulator with comprehensive and very intimate details of the content and makeup of the cells already in the market, as well as how they were being managed. And 2 years later, we were given the very first draft conduct standard on which to comment. In effect, it informed us of FSCA's intentions to prohibit cell owners from selling any other products other than those in the cell. But they did retain that concept of affinity. It was 2 years later, in 2020, that a new conduct standard was published and open for comment from stakeholders. And as I've already mentioned, the market was turned on its head by these new proposals, even though they were not much different to the proposals we had signed off back in 2018. Needless to say, FSCA was swamped with objections and recommendations, and they counted each and every one in their submission to Cabinet. That document is publicly available. If you want a copy, we can send it to you. So let's now have a look at what their concerns were. I know that those persons that are affected by this new regulation are not really interested in the reasons put forward by FSCA. But if any dealership out there is thinking of requesting some form of exemption, that dealership must be in a position to provide justification as to why the arguments put forward by FSCA will not apply. So it's actually important to know what those arguments are. Now, as I go through these, please just bear in mind that this conduct standard is not aimed at the cell owner. It applies solely to cell carriers, in other words, the actual insurers. It outlines the conditions and restrictions imposed on insurers when offering cell captive arrangements. So if an exemption is requested for any reason, that exemption must be applied for by the insurer, not the cell owner. But you'll be pleased to know that in FSCA's what they call Statement of Need document submitted alongside the draft conduct standard, they specifically state that they will consider providing an exemption if it can be demonstrated that it will improve competition in the market. So there's nothing to lose in applying. In these next few slides, I'll cover the primary arguments put forward by FSCA. They say that the arm's length nature of third-party cell captive arrangements prohibit the insurers from ensuring that customers are given fair treatment. They argue that the conduct of business returns that have been received from cell captive insurers support their view that insurers exercise inadequate oversight of cell captive business. They say that the risk is exacerbated in instances where the insurer has a large number of third-party cell captive arrangements, but due to budgetary and other factors, they are constrained by the inadequacy of their internal resources that they have available. And as a consequence, FSCA believes that insurers are unable to exercise the level and frequency of effective oversight, and therefore cannot ensure that every cell owner is consistently adhering to the standards of conduct expected of all insurers. So to get an exemption, it's going to be necessary for the insurer to prove that that argument is groundless. They believe that where the cell owner is an NMI, such as it is with motor dealerships, the motive to ensure profitability of a cell structure in order to earn dividends gives rise to serious conflicts of interest in the sales and distribution processes. In particular, they say that the profit motive often drives the selling of products that are not the most appropriate for a particular policyholder. They say that the consequences of this mis-selling often result in the product not doing what the customer expects it to do due to the policyholder's misunderstanding of restrictions and exclusions. They also say that they have evidence that in many instances a policyholder is under the impression that a range of products are available and that the F&I is recommending the product that is most suitable to meet the customer's needs and objectives. They say that the reality, however, is that the F&I is actually recommending a specific product, not because it's the most suitable, but because of the benefit derived from the underwriting profit in the cell captive. And they go on to say that although the phased general code of conduct requires cell owners to disclose to the policyholder that the existence of any conflicts of interest, that these disclosures are not always adequate, and that they believe that those disclosures, no matter how comprehensive, could never be sufficient to adequately mitigate the risks, particularly given the level of financial literacy of the average policyholder. I'm inclined to think that that's going to be the most difficult argument to counter. On the other hand, there's another argument which is probably the easiest to counter, particularly in the motor industry. We can't argue that the motive of a cell owner to ensure the profitability of the cell may drive biased claims handling. But if the claims handling service is contracted out by the cell owner to a totally unrelated and independent party, this argument cannot stand. The same applies to Fisker's argument that the cell owner has the ability to exert influence on the extent of cover and the premiums charged. If a specialist and independent underwriting manager is appointed to make these decisions, I believe that these arguments can be repelled. Insurance intermediaries operating in the retail market have argued for years that cell captive owners capitalize on loopholes in regulatory systems in order to circumvent unfavorable regulations. Those unfavorable regulations would relate to the fact that intermediaries are prevented from earning an underwriting profit from the insurance products that they sell, but a cell captive owner can. Now, Fisker actually supports those arguments. They say that the earning of dividends within a cell structure creates regulatory arbitrage and results in uneven playing fields between intermediaries, thereby driving unfair competition in the insurance market. Right, now that covers Fisker's main arguments. Let's take a look at the conduct standard itself. I've already said that this conduct standard is aimed at cell captive insurers and not cell captive owners. The requirements detailed in this conduct standard are extremely harsh, and there can be no doubt that the insurers will have to completely revise and upgrade their compliance monitoring programs, which will inevitably result in what the cell owners are going to refer to as interference or harassment. It was never my intention today to list all the requirements imposed on insurers. They've already studied this conduct standard. They know exactly what's in store for them. But let me give you a quick look at some of those things so that you can better understand how it's going to affect you as a cell owner. The insurer will be responsible to ensure that products are designed in a manner which makes them suitable, not just for the types of vehicles sold, but primarily for the types, kinds, or categories of policyholders. In other words, you've got to take into account different cultures and income groups of the customers. The captive insurer will also be held directly responsible to ensure that the insurance policies provide fair value to every different type of buyer within those categories. They will be looking at the selling processes and will have to monitor those processes to ensure that they are professionally followed. Believe it or not, the insurer will also be held directly responsible if the cell owner's business model and organizational culture is not designed or structured to promote the fair treatment of customers. Until now, cell owners have largely enjoyed very low claims ratios against gross premium. In terms of this new standard, cell captive insurers will be held responsible to ensure that premiums are fair, that the insurance products provide consistently fair value to policyholders, and that the claims ratios are indicative of that fair value. Although they haven't given us any benchmarks, presumably the benchmark would link to other personal lines insurance arrangements. So you'll now understand why I said earlier that this regulation will inevitably result in what the cell owners are going to refer to as interference or harassment or something similar. Okay, so now let's take a look at the conditions by which cell captives can be owned in the motor sector, in fact in any sector, but particularly in the motor sector. In addition to the fact that the insurer will have to be more intrusive, there are two ownership conditions with which cell owners are going to have to comply. The first is that a cell owner will only be able to sell products which are placed in the cell owner's cell no other products can be sold. This means that OEM's products cannot be sold, nor can any other independent insurance products be sold, even if the cell captive's insurer also carries the OEM's products. Let's just look at that. In other words, if your cell is placed with Guardrisk and Toyota's products are also placed with Guardrisk, you will still only be allowed to sell your own products. If a dealership wishes to distribute more than the products it has in its cell captive, it will have to relinquish its cell captive. The second is that a cell captive owner can only have a cell captive with one short-term insurer and one long-term insurer. A microcell can also be considered, but at this stage, I can't see any dealership wanting to go down that road, so I'm not going to discuss that here. But if you do want to talk about that, you can talk to your compliance officer or call any one of us, and we'll give you more information about that. The main problem is that if you decide to go the cell-only route, this might curtail some of the expansion ideas that you're likely to have in the future. For instance, you might want to expand your product range, but cannot do so, because the only way you'll be able to do that is to include them in your cell, which may not have an adequate capital base required. But in any event, with any new product, you'll need to build a portfolio just to gain experience. And as you will not be able to make use of a different insurer, you'll be restricted to the products in your cell. A transition arrangement is included in the conduct standard. You have been given 2 years to comply with this new regulation. Although transition or grace periods are frequently extended, I personally don't believe that you should rely on this. Whatever route you take, your entire business model will have to change. There can be no doubt about that. So all cell owners must think long and hard as to which model best suits them in the longer term and put a strategy in place to ensure a seamless transition. Okay, so what are your alternatives? Obviously, you can accept it and merely change your business model. I've already said you've got 2 years to do this, which will give you plenty of time to consider the advantages and disadvantages of each option. In all probability, the OEMs will have a lot to say about this, so presumably you'll be having several meetings with them. But based on some of the discussions I've had with some of our clients, it's clear that a few of you, if not all, will be asking your insurer to apply for an exemption. If your insurer is confident that your approach to business is already customer-centric and your governance culture clearly supports a fair treatment of clients, you might be successful. The main problem is that not all cell owners will have that culture, and your insurer is going to be placed in a very difficult position if it has to deny some dealerships and admit others in its exemption application. It will certainly be worth discussing this with the insurer if you think you qualify and can counter Fiskars' arguments that I've been through today. Another approach could be to run your captive off and buy into a commune cell captive. There are a number of commune cell captives operating in our market, but no reference to these has ever been made by Fiskars, so I'm not sure how this is going to be received by them. A commune cell captive is where an underwriting management company, not being a non-mandated intermediary, and who operates solely on behalf of an insurer, sets up its own cell captive and offers preference shares or other special shares to dealerships, who will then place insurance business in that cell captive. The business that they place in the cell would obviously be ring-fenced, with the underwriting profit distributed through the dividend mechanism back to the dealership. In effect, it works in the same way as an ordinary cell captive structure. The conduct standard, kind of read in conjunction with the Financial Sector Regulation Act and the Insurance Act, prohibits the dealership from owning a cell captive and at the same time acting as an agent for other product suppliers. However, owning shares in a company that owns a cell captive is not restricted, unless that shareholding falls within the definition of significant owner. Now, significant ownership relates to a person who has the ability to control or influence the business or strategy of the company. Now, most commune cell captive operations ensure that participants have no control whatsoever over its governing body. So having a share in a commune cell captive is clearly not prohibited. There is a caveat though. You all know that we are swiftly moving towards principle-based legislation. So it's possible that FSCA will see this as a breach of the principle it intends to achieve. If this is the case, the Financial Sector Regulation Act gives FSCA the power to declare that as unfair business conduct. There can be no doubt that the management of these commune captives will have discussed this with their legal teams and also with FSCA. So it is important, if you're presently participating in one of these arrangements or considering participating in one of these arrangements, that you meet with their management to discuss the way forward. Another way to partly overcome this is to set up a first-party cell captive. The legislation that I've been discussing only applies to third-party cell structures. In effect, a first-party cell captive covers the operational risk of the cell owner and, where appropriate, the operational risks of its associates. There is nothing to stop a dealership from providing a guarantee or a warranty to a customer when the dealership sells a vehicle, provided that it forms part of the sale and is not a voluntary or add-on product or service. In other words, if a pre-owned vehicle is sold for an amount of, say, 150,000 Rand, there is no reason why the dealership cannot supply a warranty to the extent that if there is any mechanical breakdown covered by the warranty, the dealership will collect the vehicle and repair it at no cost to the customer. If a first-party cell captive is in place, the dealership would then make a claim against its first-party cell captive arrangement and can recover the costs incurred. Now, the cell arrangement would be financed by premium, which forms part of the selling price, in the same way that a manufacturer finances its own warranties. As a working example, let's assume that the market retail price of a 3-year-old car is around 200,000 rands. The vehicle would be put up for sale, not for 200,000, but for kind of, say, 210,000, but sold with the dealership's warranty, which would provide the dealership with a major selling argument. On completion of the sale, the 10,000 Rand extra will be paid as premium by the dealership into its cell captive, thereby allowing the dealership to fund future warranty claims from off-balance sheet funds without impact on its normal operating costs. Any surplus in the cell can then be paid to the dealership through the dividend mechanism, the same way as it's done with third-party cells. Now, this obviously cannot work for new vehicles, as the OEMs prohibit retail price loading. So in that respect, the dealership would only sell OEM's warranties in terms of its FSP license. In other words, it would have its first-party captive for pre-owned cars, and for new vehicles where they want to use the OEMs, they sell the OEM's products and just earn commission. If you decide to keep your captive or set up a first-party captive, it will be prudent to ensure that you have a comprehensive service level agreement with your administrator. So in my next presentation, I'll be going through the reasons why an SLA is necessary, and I shall provide my views as to what should be included in that SLA. And with that, back to the team.
Let me unmute you, Pete.
Okay,
Yep, I can hear you. No? Can you unmute? There we go.
I'm unmute. Okay, thanks. Right. Okay, I'm
There
kind
was
of
a-
open for questions. If anybody's interested out there.
Yeah, I do apologize if there was any glitches. It's been a bit of a rough morning. I even had a power surge and lost my own monitor, so I do apologize. Is there any questions that that you would like to raise with Peter? Okay, Jeanette has got a query. Can I ask you to unmute, Jeanette? There we go.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Lekker.
Yeah.
Pete, during the presentation, you sort of went away for a little bit. I couldn't hear what you said, and it was specifically with regards to the commune cell captive.
Yeah.
And I wanted to actually ask, because the problem is, what I've said to our clients, this is really a concern, is are we going to sit with the situation where the OEM is going to say, choose either the badge or your cell captive? And would a commune cell captive possibly be a solution for a situation like that, in that the OEMs have, all the OEMs are part of a commune cell captive as well as our clients, so they all have the sort of a little captive within a captive, like a beehive. You know, you own a little section, your policies are written for your target market, your premiums are calculated accordingly, which means that the F&Is would be able to sell a group captive as well as that, a group product as well as that of the OEM, because they all form part of the big bucket. So the big captive, that's number one. And number two, I'm very, very interested to see how the insurers will monitor the treatment of customers in this regard. I mean, are they only going to have a look at claims and complaints? Are they going to do on-site visits? How the hell are they going to see where the clients were treated fairly? So yeah, that's it, Pete.
Well, I think the best people to answer that question are the insurers themselves. But let's just talk about those again. The commune cell captive. That's my definition of them, by the way, or my description of them. It's not something that the word commune is not something that is just regularly understood. It's just, to me, the best way of explaining it. And we're going to try to determine the difference between a commune cell captive and association captive. An association cell. An association cell is where there is an association of, like in fact, in the motor sector, we've got institutes and we've got associations such as the IDA and so on, which is where an association is formed as an association and there's a difference in shareholding between the participants. A commune is where it's a complete third party. And I mean a complete third party. It's not owned by any particular dealership or any particular participant in that, or the owner's participant. It's just a cell captive set up by a complete third party who says, right, I've now got this cell captive and we're going to specialize in this type of insurance. And if somebody wants to participate, we can ring fence their portfolios. So there's no ownership of the cell captive at all by the participants. They're just minor shareholders, usually preference shareholders. They could be Class A or Class B shares that they have. So, and there's quite a few of them around, some larger than others. But the downside, as I mentioned, is that we're not sure, I'm not sure, certainly, as to how FSCA is going to approach these, because if we look at principal controlled, principal regulated legislation, and the principle is that they don't want a motor dealer, and I'll just say motor dealer for this purpose, they don't want a motor dealer to be able to push business into its own cell and at the same time have an agency with others, because the client perceives that to be an independent intermediary, and that person is not independent in the eyes of FSCA, because they're going to push as much business as they can into their cell, whether they own it or whether they just participate in it. I have this horrible feeling that will become a specific prohibition. And I don't know quite how to deal with that. I'm not one of these people that would like to go to FSCA right at the start to say, how are you going to look at this? Because my experience of those is that they always say no. So you kind of have to do it first. So somebody's going to have the courage to put that together. But I do believe these commune cell owners, not the participants, the owners, have a responsibility to ascertain that, because there's no ways that a motor dealer or any other dealer can go down that road, having spent quite a long time revising their business models, to find that FSCA shut the door on them. So that's on the communes. The same applies whether it's an OEM or whoever participates on it. It depends on who owns it. If it's a third-party owner, it's a commune. If it's owned by one of the OEMs, or they are controlled, they have some kind of control over the management or the governing body of that cell captive, then that is clearly prohibited already. Your second question I didn't quite catch, because you actually broke up. So can you just repeat that second question again?
Absolutely. You said that the insurers will be responsible to monitor the fair treatment of customers by the representatives and everybody involved in that cell captive. Now they can have a look at the claims ratio. They can have a look at the complaints. Do you think this is how else will they check fair treatment or monitor fair treatment of customers? Will they do on-site visits? Are they going to have the manpower to do it? Because if they want to do it properly, I think they need to appoint us.
Oh, I love it. You know, what you say is 100%, but there's one aspect that you didn't mention, and I think I didn't mention it, so it's probably my fault. But in terms of that new regulation, all complaints have to go direct to the insurer. So in other words, it's going to be complaint driven. See, at this point in time, the complaints go to the administrator, but it's very, very clear they have to go to the insurer. Whether the insurer can argue that the administrator is in fact part of the insurer, that's questionable. But clearly the regulation itself states that all complaints have to go, and I suppose it's going to be complaints driven. I also think there's going to be monitoring done, and I think that you're right, it's also gone through my mind. How is the insurer going to monitor, and also the services? I suspect that what they will do is they will demand increased monitoring by the various compliance officers, the external compliance officers, and will be asking for copies of those compliance reports. That is what I suspect. But how those insurers are going to do it, I actually don't know. So I can't answer that. It's a pity we don't have any insurers listening in at this point, unless maybe there are, but I think it's just aimed at our clients. It would be nice to hear from Guardrisk or Centric or Hollard or somebody on this issue. Yeah. Guardrisk seem to have a lot of these communes, so maybe Guardrisk is the company to respond to that.
Yeah, all right. My biggest concern is just the OEMs
Yeah.
that also have captives. I mean, that's going to have a huge impact. And in most of the instances, if you have, and I know this for a fact, one of all the products are better than that of the OEMs. It's just better cover and cheaper, and it's the way they've designed it. But we also have clients that really don't care how great your products are. They like the Toyota or VW badge, and therefore they want that specific product.
Oh, sure. You know,
And that's
they are
income
brain
that,
punches.
yeah, so
The real issue, of course, is the OEMs in that they are usually demanding that certain targets be met so that other benefits can be awarded or provided to the dealership, such as price on parts or whatever it might be. So I think the OEMs are going to have a lot to do with this, and there's no doubt that dealers are going to have to sit with their OEMs to find out how they can make up any loss that they would otherwise have earned if they had their own cell captives. It's as simple as that. The OEMs have got to come to the party here as well, as far as I'm concerned. But there's no doubt in my mind that a dealer should keep their policy structures as minimal as possible to make it easy to deal with clients. So I think the OEMs have got to respond to this.
all right. Yeah, okay, I'll keep quiet now. It gives somebody else a chance to ask a question. I'm sure there's 1,000 hands up.
There are any other questions that
There are no
the panelists
questions. I was obviously very succinct in what I say.
So I'm just scrolling down the list. I can't see any hands
Okay.
that
Great.
have gone up. All right, so I will then continue with the second part of this particular presentation of yours, which will be the service level agreements that need to be entered into with regards to the cell owners and their administrators. And if there are a number of questions that are raised between that, we will have another Q&A session afterwards. All right.
Fine.
That a much closer relationship has to be established with those outsourced partners. I'm confident that in general terms, where you outsource services, you already have an SLA in place which states in detail your expectations and the obligations of the service provider. Yet only a few of our clients that own cell captives have a comprehensive service level agreement with their appointed administrators. There's a good reason for this, but perhaps it's time to review it. The relationship between the cell captive owner and the administrator is very unusual. The actual appointment of the administrator is made by the insurer, not by the cell captive owner. And the contract that drives the administrator's services and performance is included not in an SLA with the cell owner, but in a binder agreement provided to the administrator by the insurer. And this causes a considerable amount of confusion. The administrator often sees the policyholder as its client. The insurer sees that same policyholder as its client, and the dealership sees the policyholder as its client. So who's correct? In respect of advice and intermediary services, the policyholder is clearly the client of the dealership. If the policyholder lodges a complaint about the way a policy is sold or the information provided at the point of sale, the dealership is responsible. And that responsibility is carried right through to the termination of the policy. I mean, as an example, if a new vehicle enjoys a 3-year manufacturer's warranty and a 2-year extended warranty is sold to the customer, the dealership will retain that responsibility and liability for a period of 5 years, which is long after the commission is earned and forgotten. As well as generating commissions and dividends from underwriting profits, the policies sold to the customer support the dealership's primary business. And we all know that a happy customer consistently returns to make additional purchases. So the lifetime value of a customer can never be overestimated. For these reasons, it's imperative that the dealership is kept informed of the dealings that the administrator has with the dealership's customers, particularly in respect of claims. When a claim is met, the reputation is earned by the administrator or the insurer, not the dealership. But when it comes to complaints or levels of unhappiness, it is always the dealership to whom the finger is pointed. Very often, the dealership does not even know that a complaint has been lodged. This impacts on the reputation of the dealership without the dealership even knowing about it. And that brings us to the SLA itself. Usually, an SLA would detail the purpose of the SLA and list all the services that will be carried out. These are already comprehensively detailed in the binder agreement issued by the insurer, so there's no need to repeat them in the SLA. It might, however, be in your interest to make reference to the conditions and terms of the binder within the SLA, but of course this would be up to you. If I was writing an SLA, I would ask for a copy of the binder and append it to the SLA, but that's just me, I suppose. I like to have things formally documented. Nor is it necessary today for me to deal with the general clauses, for example, indemnities, laws that have to be followed, POPIA, confidentialities and stuff like that, because you've probably already got standard wordings for that. So today, I want to concentrate on the more specific issues, which I think are important. The insurer is responsible to carry out due diligence and monitoring of every binder holder. And that monitoring will address record keeping, reporting, and random testing of operational activities. It will also address the administrator's approach to TCF and will probably include some form of testing to measure performance levels. So one of the requirements in your SLA should be that within a certain number of days after the insurer's review report is received by the administrator, a copy should be submitted to the dealership. That way, you'll quickly pick up how the administrator is performing and where reviews of the services may be required. Now, there are three other important issues that the dealership should address in the SLA, in my opinion, and I'll deal with each one in turn. The first relates to claims. It's important for the dealership to see at a glance how the cell captive is performing and where the costs occur. To do this, a very simple report can be requested showing the gross premiums received during a month, the total and makeup of expenses which are deducted from the gross premium, and the total amount of claims paid. This will also allow the dealership to keep a watching brief on the claims ratios, which I previously mentioned seems to have risen much higher on FSCA's conduct agenda. The dealership will also need to know the number of claims rejected or partially rejected during each month and why they were rejected. This is important, not just to know where complaints may be lodged, but also to ascertain whether or not adequate disclosures are being made by your F&Is at the point of sale. The second important issue is to analyze complaints. So a list of complaints and the causes should be provided to the dealership regularly. Social media has the power to destroy or make a dealership's reputation. So all complaints, whatever the reason, have to be dealt with as rapidly as possible. Complaints can even be useful because they can highlight a problem and by dealing with the cause can prevent further complaints in the future. Every administrator is required in our insurance laws to maintain a full record of complaints broken down into 9 different categories. So asking for this information on a monthly basis is not going to create any burden on the administrator. The third report that a dealership may ask for is a list of all the cancellations that have been requested in the month, together with the reasons why the customer cancelled. The primary cause could be affordability or some other circumstantial reason, but it could highlight a more sinister problem, which you can therefore address. Finally, we have to look at cancellation or termination of the SLA. In normal circumstances, an SLA can be cancelled by providing the service provider with a number of days' notice, or if a material term is breached. But this can't apply with this type of SLA simply because the services are driven through a binder agreement with the insurer. As a consequence, the only way to cancel is to approach the insurer and request them to trigger cancellation in terms of the binder agreement. But there are some serious implications to this. There are stepping clauses to consider, as well as communications that necessarily have to take place with each and every policyholder. And experience has shown that in doing this, a considerable amount of business will be lost. One way of dealing with this is to include some form of financial penalty in the event of non-performance, but this kind of decision I would have to leave, I suggest, to every dealership to decide within their own management as to how they want to deal with that. So that's it for now. I thank you for listening. And with that, let me hand you back to the team.
Thanks again, Peter.
Pleasure. Any questions?
Just rolling through them. Whilst your video is playing, just for the participants, I did have a quick message from Jeanette. And just before we go through questions, if there are any, she just wants to have a quick word with regards to the FSCA's communications around the RFI. But I will open that up through to Jen very shortly. To our participants, are there any questions regarding the service level agreements between the captive holders and the administrators?
Kelly, great.
No, I don't have any.
Okay.
So with that, what I will do is ask Jeanette through to
Okay.
Unmute, and then I will promote through to a panelist.
Okay, then I'll say fairly well. And
Jen, are you around?
Yes, I am. Sorry.
There we go.
Now I can speak. FSCA has released a communication 29 of 2022 where they're asking you to complete a survey on the financial soundness of your entity. So what we've done is we've spoken to Shireen Nortier and we asked her, what's the information? So in terms of section 131 of the Financial Sector Regulation Act, the FSCA has the authority to ask for certain questions. So do not comply with that. They can issue a fine of R1,000 per day of late submission for as long as it takes you to submit the information that they need. That is a request for information. It's a must. You have to complete this. This communication, however, is a survey. And what she said is that you don't have to complete it, but they're really asking nicely that you do complete it. So from our side, and I've gone through the survey, it has to be completed and submitted by the 22nd of November. And I do think you guys all know that the FSCA is struggling to understand the motor industry and how their financials work, that you sweep money from accounts to actually keep the business going, and so on and so on. And they've changed the definitions in the new fit and proper requirements, which might have a negative impact on your ability to either meet the solvency or asset requirements. I have spoken to Caroline Viljoen about this a couple of days ago, and she asked if we could do a group session where we can go through the survey question by question, and you guys can answer it as we go through it. So I'm more than happy to do that now or in a separate session. But what I want to do, James, I can share, hey? Yeah, I think so. Share that. Right. You guys see this screen? Anybody, James, if you can just shout out and tell me whether you can see it. I
can see that, Jen. Yep.
Right. So this communication tells you to the fact that the FECA wants to see whether the changes in definitions and requirements on financial solvency after the release of Board Notice 194 of 2017 has had a negative impact on your ability to meet the requirements. So this is the workshops that they've held. You can go and listen to it. I've attended both. There wasn't really a lot that was new. You can also click on this link here, and there's a little video that tells you exactly how to complete the survey. But if you want to complete the survey, you can just click on that little button and hopefully it opens. Can you still see, James?
Yes, I can, Jen.
Right, so can I perhaps ask if you can just ask if the people can just raise their hands and tell me if they want me to go through the survey with them now. It will take about half an hour. If anybody's interested, otherwise we can arrange a separate session for this.
So at this particular point, no hands have been raised.
All right.
There is, hold a second, there is one. One hand raised, which is Jane.
Okay.
So maybe then a separate, if it's just Jane, then arrange a separate meeting.
Right. Okay, Jane, I'll phone you after this and we can run through it. It really is very, very basic. There's a couple of things that how do I stop share? Good grief.
Just
I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm terribly sorry.
in your bottom, you'll see a share screen. Just say stop sharing.
Waar daar's hy? Skus tog, here I am. Right, so I really want to urge you to complete this. It will give the FECA some kind of indication of what you're struggling with. They do focus on the COVID period and the floods to find out if that has had a negative impact on you, and whether you've recovered, and if you haven't recovered, how long it's going to take you to recover. They also talk about the juristic representative solvency and status. So please, if I can ask you guys, make a plan and complete this. It's the only way that we're going to be able to show the FECA what's going on in the motor industry and what is the problems that we are facing. So, right, yeah, I think that's it from my side. Anybody, any questions?
Nothing has come up.
Right, so just another thing, if you're not collecting premium, your questions will end at number 51. If you are collecting premiums, you'll have to complete all of them. It's about 74 odd questions that you need to complete. All right. So yeah. All right, that's it from me.
Super, thanks, Jen. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
And then, yes, this would then conclude the second of our webinars and our October session. This particular webinar will be uploaded onto our webinar section under our website, acmotor.co.za. If you do have any queries or questions with regards to the presentation on the new changes in the captives, and the service level agreements. Peter's email is on screen. And then with regards to the FSCA's RFI survey, if you can get hold of Jeanette. And for those that have messaged me, I'll get hold of Jeanette right now and ask her to set up a prior appointment with you. Thanks again for attending. I really do, and we really do appreciate it. And have an enjoyable day further. Thank you very much.
Thanks, James. Thanks all.
Thank you,
Cheerio.
everybody.
Thanks, Jen.
Thanks. Bye.